Hello everyone, this is another Grim Dawn class examination with your host, Professor Reha. Now this is going to be the video on the final Demolitionist combination, the Shieldbreaker, which is Demolitionist Oathkeeper. Now, similar to the Oathkeeper with the Soldier, and this will be the last time you'll really... well, the second to last time you're going to see the Oathkeeper dealt with very quickly, but the Demolitionist and the Oathkeeper combination here, the Shieldbreaker, is another one of those combinations where you can build pretty much any way you want and it will work really well. You can go with the classic Shield Oathkeeper, go into Fire Strike, and go into Searing Strike if you want to, or you can keep with the Righteous Fervor. Pretty much, it's best to summarize the Shieldbreaker with this statement. If you aren't going into poison, acid, and vitality damage using Path of the Three or the modifiers for certain key skills, you can do whatever you want, and it works really well. This is actually one of the few builds, though, I will point this out. This is one of the few builds that I will wield a pistol with a shield. It's not very often that I do this. This is one of the few builds that I will do, well, one of the few classes I will do this with fairly regularly. The rest of the time, it really depends upon the circumstances. For example, I have experimented around with a shield and pistol pyromancer build one time. It wasn't that great, but I experimented with it one time. But for the purposes of regular use of a pistol and a shield, this is the class that I use this for. And this is basically, whereas with the Demolitionist Inquisitor, the Purifier, you can dual-wield pistols with the melee and do substantially more damage. This one is... the Shieldbreaker using a pistol is more along the lines of, I'm going to shoot you to death from a distance if I can, but if you get into melee, I don't mind. It's not really going to necessarily do more damage in melee. You probably could get away with building some decent retaliation damage. For example, I often find myself building just the Vindictive Flame part for the total speed, and then any kind of retaliation damage Vindictive Flame is dealing to melee enemies is just a bonus. But this is, I guess, what I would call the safe ranged potential here. Obviously, you can use melee weapons. The build has a lot of options for melee weapons, be they single hand, two hand, what have you. It's not like you have to use a shield. You don't need Safeguard. You don't need Aegis of Men here. You don't need Righteous Fervor, although this is pretty nice. You can absolutely just go with Judgment, which is actually really good for ranged people, because you can actually kind of blast people away, or towards you if you really want. Whichever. I believe this blasts people away, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyways, you get the fire, physical, and internal trauma damage here, which combos very well with a lot of what the Demolitionist does. Flame Touch and Temper obviously come in big here again. You have Granado again. There's just a lot going on here that you can really make work. But if you want... how do I put this? This build is the definition of Jack of all trades. You can equip pretty much any type of equipment and make it work. You can play in absolutely any playstyle, make it work. Pardon me. You are really completely unlimited in how you want to play this. Obviously, in terms of damage output, you're basically looking at physical, pierce, fire, and lightning. Obviously. In terms of your damage output, you are somewhat limited. But in terms of actually how you play this build, you have basically just no pets. That's about it. And before you say, oh, Guardian of Empyrean, they scale with player bonuses, not pet bonuses, so they don't actually count as pets. Technically. But that being said, you can go ranged, you can go two-handed ranged, two-handed melee, single-hand ranged with a shield, single-hand ranged with an offhand, if you really want to. You can go single-hand melee with a shield. You can go single-hand melee with an offhand. Just absolutely go for it. There's no limits here. This is if you want to experiment with your playstyle, if you're coming into this game and you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't know what my playstyle is, or, gee, I really want to try a different playstyle, I would recommend this class. Because this is the safest class with which you can experiment with various playstyles. If you've never used a two-handed melee weapon before, this is one of the safer options. Now, technically, Soldier Oathkeeper is safer. Technically, Warlord, which is the actual name of that class, is safer. Technically. But the problem with the Warlord is that there are a lot of skills in that combination that do somewhat rely, well, more from the Soldier side, they rely a little bit more on shield use. Whereas the Shieldbreaker, you have a lot of alternative options. You have a lot more crowd control options. You could go into Blackwater Cocktail, which does a lot for reducing the enemy's defenses. You can go into Vindictive Flame with Ulzuin's Wrath, get yourself some retaliation damage, get yourself some damage absorption. You've got Blast Shield, of course. You have all the Oathkeeper stuff. You can go pretty, again, heavy on retaliation. You can aggressively use it with Granado if you want to increase some retaliation using Presence of Virtue and then go into Granado. That's fantastic. There's just a whole lot. The sky's the limit here, actually. But this is a very safe combination to experiment with anything. Another thing that kind of takes away from the Warlord's ability for experimentation is that they have much less emphasis on ranged, whereas the Shieldbreaker, there is no particular favoring of any one particular weapon type. There's a mild eyebrow raise if you decide to offhand with this combination. I will admit that. But that's about the only item you may want to stay clear from is offhands, because if you're going to have a single-hand weapon, you might as well slap a shield on there and survive a little longer. Unless you have an offhand that actually enhances the Shieldbreaker in a very specific way that you're looking for, you're probably going to want a shield instead. It's just the way it works, which is fine. And again, you still can use offhands if you find the right ones. They still can exponentially increase your damage output if you really want to dedicate yourself to it. As for the 3 skills from each that you may want to particularly consider, this one is going to be obviously flame touched. Temper again is a personal choice. None of you are surprised. Obviously Granado, again, none of you are really going to be surprised. Granado is a pretty commonly useful ability in a lot of builds. But for my last recommendation, Vindictive Flame. No matter how you build this particular class, Vindictive Flame, at the very least, Vindictive Flame. You don't necessarily need Ulzuin's Wrath, that really depends on your build and what you feel. But Vindictive Flame is really nice. The total speed, the health regeneration, the ability to retaliate against melee enemies without any kind of effort on your part. It's great. It's fantastic. The ability to potentially stun enemies that are near you is also pretty nice. Obviously, that's increased further with Ulzuin's Wrath, but even if you're using ranged weapons, and you don't think you're going to use this Vindictive Flame, you will. Just shoot them and let them come into melee with you. Like I said, unlike with the Purifier, which is aggressively looking to get in the enemy's face, this build doesn't... If you're using ranged with this, you're not necessarily looking to get into the enemy's face, you just don't really have a problem if they do. That's basically the difference there. So, with that being said, these 3 skills are what I would give some serious thought to if you're playing a Shieldbreaker of any variety. For the Oathkeeper, I would actually strongly suggest potentially Celestial Prayer or the Guardian of Empyrean, which, by the way, gets bonuses from Flame Touched, so that can really boost their damage output there. And they reduce the physical and fire resistances of your enemies as well, which is very nice. Other things that are very useful that I find is Ascension. I find this to be extremely effective on this combination. Again, even if you don't think you're going to use that retaliation damage, you would be very surprised. You can go all the way up to here. I almost never use Clarity of Purpose, personally. There are occasional moments where maybe against a particular boss, I'll go ahead and boost this temporarily and then just take the points back out later, but I don't often go into the Clarity of Purpose. And last but not least, of course, Resilience. is always fantastic. Now, the reason why I don't really recommend a whole lot of other things, although I will throw out the argument that Presence of Virtue is pretty nice, is because these are somewhat conditional. Sometimes you really want Righteous Fervor, especially if you're going into a Retaliation build. Retribution is what you want to go for. But if you're not looking to go into Retaliation, Fire Strike may be better, or at least up to Explosive Strike. If you use Static Strike, that's entirely up to you. Again, I almost never use Brimstone with this combination because there's just no benefit to adding in the Chaos damage, and even though I will throw out the Blackwater Cocktail as a good defensive option, often there are better ones in this combination, because again, you don't really need the Chaos damage that this can bust out, but there are times where I have built all the way up to Agonizing Flames just because I really wanted those stat decreases on the enemies. This is another class where Ulzuin's Chosen can really pull a lot of weight, but it's very, very rare that I build this on this class, because I don't often want to use stun jacks. There's such an emphasis on fire between both these classes that stun jacks just feel somewhat underwhelming a lot of the time. I'm actually going to, for a moment here, recommend you not really go into Hellfire Mine. You have no ability to inflict Aether damage. Now, if you're playing multiplayer, again, I say this a lot with Hellfire Mine. Hellfire Mine is particularly great in multiplayer. But for this class, if you're gonna do anything here, you're gonna stick with Thermite Mine. It's just how it goes. So, ultimately, that's really where we're looking at here. Another thing you might want to keep an eye out for is not going into Path of the Three. You're converting a lot of your fire and physical damage into acid and poison, which isn't a bad thing normally, but considering that the Demolitionist has absolutely no method of increasing poison acid or vitality, this will essentially kill your damage output, hands down. Adding on to that, obviously, any of these crystal modifiers you don't want to do because they're converting all of your fire damage and physical damage into something that you can't boost with Demolitionists. So you generally want to avoid those. But yeah, as long as you remember to stay away from anything that doesn't say fire or physical, oh, this says vitality and acid, don't touch that. This says acid, don't touch that. This says acid and vitality, don't touch that. It's basically, this is okay, Volcanic Might. I almost never use this because, frankly, in most of the builds that I play, physical damage is being increased just as much as fire damage, so it doesn't really make a huge difference. The only time this really matters is if you go into Flame Touched but not Temper. In that case, you're going to want to make that conversion, but otherwise it does not make a difference. Or if you have some kind of item that massively increases fire damage over physical damage, then I would say, yeah, Volcanic Might is fine. But this is something I almost never go into more because it doesn't matter. But yeah, you can pretty much go to town with this and have a grand old time. As long as you stay away from the poison acid, there's no wrong way of going about this. And of course, Hellfire Mine. And again, I don't really use Brimstone or Blackwater Cocktail. Blackwater Cocktail is if you're desperate. If you're dying a whole lot and you're really desperate for some method of surviving, that's when you go into Blackwater Cocktail. But I've almost never had that issue because there's so many good ways of staying alive in Oathkeeper that it never presents a problem. So, with that being said, this is just really that straightforward. This is a very straightforward class that you can build and play. So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me with this, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, what have you, please leave them down in the comments below. If you liked this, please like and subscribe, and as always, have a great 24 hours.